I'm going to start. What's up, guys? This is Wednesday. I'm a little early, but it says I've got viewers waiting. So if you're watching live, that's great. If you're watching recording, that's fine too. Today we're going to look at Chapter 3 of The Shadow over Innsmouth. First two chapters are on there on our playlist, and those weren't live videos, but I'll try different things to get the job done. So here's the link, but there'll also be a link in the assignment that I post. And if you want to check on here, there's the calendar for the quarter or for the whole semester. And if you scroll down to April, you'll see we got this month, next month, pretty much 8 full weeks. Today we're going to look at Chapter 3 of The Shadow over Innsmouth. You might have taken a break because we looked at the first two before spring break, so I'm going to take just a minute to recap and make sure we're not lost. So Chapter 1, our narrator said there's this town called Innsmouth, and it was raided by the feds. Buildings were blown up, people were taken away, and it was all covered up. Outsiders don't know for sure what happened, and they think it may be a prohibition-related incident because this is set in the late 20s. But then the narrator says, well, I'm going to tell you what happened. One day I went there and I discovered something, blah, blah, blah. We're going to get into it. Chapter 1, he was in a nearby town, heard about Innsmouth. People said, ooh, it's scary, you don't want to go there. Everybody's strange. They all keep to themselves, and they seem to have this weird physical characteristic that makes them stand out. But our narrator saw this artifact, this tiara was the word they used, and it looked just so amazing to him that he wanted to see the place it came from. It was partially foreign. He thought, well, maybe some of these elements are from Asian culture, or maybe some of them are like not even human. It's got some weird tentacle stuff that might be from the sea. And in Chapter 2, our guy got on a bus and went to Innsmouth, and he sees the bus driver is one of the people from this town, and the bus driver looks a little weird, and we're going to get to this. He calls it the Innsmouth look, and the bus driver has this sort of grayish blue tint to his skin, and he's got some sort of light straggly hair. And the big feature that everyone points out is that he's got these big sort of bulging eyes that hardly ever blink, and everyone is sort of like creeped out by the eyes of the Innsmouth people whenever they see them. And our narrator is sort of debating with himself. He's like, is this a genetic thing? Is this a disease that affects them once they get there? Does it have to do with your proximity to a certain place? And he'll mention that as we go. But in Chapter 2, near the end, he went to the grocery store, and there was a boy at the grocery store who was not affected by this. He was a totally average-looking kid who would, they said it was a chain grocery store, and he was transferred there from elsewhere. And he doesn't like it. He thinks the town is crazy. But he's kind of figured out that you can be safe if you just keep to yourself and don't ask questions. Near the end of Chapter 2, he said, well, there's one guy who might know something, and you got to be careful, because if you talk to this guy, the town's going to turn against you. But there's one guy who might know something. There's a guy named Zadok Allen with sort of town drunk quality to him. He just hangs around, and maybe if you give him a sip of whiskey, he might tell you some facts. So that's where we left at the end of Chapter 2. Our guy is in Innsmouth. He's planning to leave very soon. I think he said he's planning to leave that night before it gets dark. Obviously, whenever you hear that in a story, you think the plans are going to be messed with. But let's read a bit and see where it goes. Chapter 3. It must have been some imp of the perverse, or some sardonic pull from dark hidden sources. which made me change my plans as I did. I had long before resolved to limit my observations to architecture alone, and I was even then hurrying toward the square in an effort to get quick transportation out of this festering city of death and decay. But the sight of old Zadok Allen set up new currents in my mind and made me slacken my pace uncertainly. So he had been walking along, and he sees this guy, and he goes, "Oh, that's the guy the grocery kid was talking about." Instead of just making my way downtown, like Vanessa Carlton, I'm going to stop and talk to this guy and see if I can find out anything. The curiosity is a problem. It might get him into trouble, but of course that's a understandable impulse, and we might feel sympathy for the narrator there. I had been assured that the old man could do nothing but hint at wild, disjointed, and incredible legends, and I had been warned that the natives made it unsafe to be seen talking to him. Yet the thought of this aged witness to the town's decay, with memories going back to the early days of ships and factories, was a lure that no amount of reason could make me resist. After all, the strangest and maddest of myths are often merely symbols or allegories based upon truth, and old Zadok must have seen everything which went on around Innsmouth for the last 90 years. Curiosity flared up beyond sense and caution, and in my youthful egotism I fancied I might be able to sift a nucleus of real history from the confused, extravagant outpouring I would probably extract with the aid of raw whiskey. I knew that I could not accost him then and there, for the firemen would surely notice and object. Instead, I reflected, I would prepare by getting some bootleg liquor at a place where the grocery boy had told me was plentiful. Then I would loaf near the fire station in apparent casualness, and fall in with old Zadok after he had started on one of his frequent rambles. The youth said that he was very restless, seldom sitting around the station for more than an hour or two at a time. A quart bottle of whiskey was easily, though not cheaply, obtained in the rear of a dingy variety store just off the square in Elliott Street. The dirty-looking fellow who waited on me had a touch of the staring Innsmouth look, but was quite civil in his way, being perhaps used to the custom of such convivial strangers, truckmen, gold buyers, and the like, as were occasionally in town. So we see that this town has some people who deal with strangers. Like the people at the grocery store probably see outsiders. The guy in the liquor store probably sees outsiders, so they might be a little more normal than, the real monstrous folk. In chapter 2, our narrator mentioned that the empty houses were the ones that had the creepy sounds coming from them. If you walk by the ones that had the lights on and it seemed alive, those were okay. But then when you walk by the abandoned haunted house looking houses, those are the ones that had the noise. So it was almost like, the public facing stuff is okay, but the hidden evil stuff is where you got to be careful. And this is a classic thing we see in a lot of stories. If you ever hear about vampires, for example, often the new vampires, the ones who go out and hunt people, are okay. They look pretty much normal, maybe a little pale, maybe a little fang. But then when you meet like the head vampire, the Nosferatu in the castle, that doesn't even look human anymore, and it's this twisted, blue monster thing. So maybe we have a similar dynamic here. Re-entering the square, I saw that luck was with me. For shuffling out of Payne Street around the corner of the Gilman house, I glimpsed nothing less than the tall, lean, tattered form of old Zadok Allen himself. In accordance with my plan, I attracted his attention by brandishing my newly purchased bottle, and soon realized that he had begun to shuffle wistfully after me as I turned into Waite Street on my way to the most deserted region I could think of. So our narrator is going to try to get this guy to follow him, because if you talk to him in public, then the town's going to be suspicious. But if you talk to him over on the side, maybe you can get some info safely. I was steering my course by the map the grocery boy had prepared, and was aiming for the wholly abandoned stretch of southern waterfront which I had previously visited. The only people in sight there had been the fishermen on the distant breakwater, and by going a few squares south I could get beyond the range of these, finding a pair of seats on some abandoned wharf and being free to question old Zadok unobserved for an indefinite time. Before I reached Main Street I could hear a faint and wheezy, "Hey, mister," behind me, and I presently allowed the old man to catch up and take copious pulls from the quart bottle. So this guy saw the whiskey, went on to be friendly, and maybe it's a success. Maybe our narrator has gotten the friendship of this guy. And he didn't take a sip. I use the word sip, but it's a copious pulls. So he's really slamming it down. And this guy is an alcoholic. Maybe he doesn't get a drink all the time. Maybe he really, devours it when he has the chance. I began putting out feelers as we walked along the water street and turned southward amidst the omnipresent desolation and crazily tilted ruins, but found that the aged tongue did not loosen as quickly as I had expected. At length I saw a grass-grown opening toward the sea between crumbling brick walls, with a weedy length of an earthen masonry wharf projecting beyond. Piles of moss-covered stones near the water promised tolerable seats, and the scene was sheltered from all possible view by a ruined water-house on the north. Here, I thought, was the ideal place for a long secret colloquy. So I guided my companion down the lane and picked out spots to sit in among the mossy stones. The air of death and desertion was ghoulish, and the smell of fish almost insufferable, but I was resolved to let nothing deter me. About 4 hours remained for conversation if I were to catch the 8 o'clock coach. Let me do the full screen here. For Arkham, and I began to dole out more liquor to the ancient tippler, meanwhile eating my own frugal lunch. In my donations, I was careful not to overshoot the mark, for I did not wish Zadok's Venus garrulousness to pass into a stupor. So you don't want to give him too much, because then he'll lose his ability to talk, and he'll just be kind of, dazed. After an hour, his furtive taciturnity showed signs of disappearing, but much to my disappointment, he still sidetracked my questions about Innsmouth and its shadow-haunted past. He would babble of current topics, revealing a wide acquaintance with newspapers, and a great tendency to philosophize in a sententious village fashion. This is the classic thing in a lot of stories where there's one guy who knows the secret, but it's the crazy guy. It could be the one who appears at the beginning, like in a Friday the 13th movie that tells you not to go to Crystal Lake, or it could be a guy that you find later who's like, the old grumpy hermit, and you have to convince him to spill the beans. But, you got to work for it. It wouldn't be fun if you just found like a normal, helpful customer service agent who would give you all the facts. You have to, otherwise everybody would know the secret. You have to really get past the defenses that prevent strangers from finding out. Toward the end of the second hour, I feared my quart of whiskey would not be enough to produce results, and was wondering whether I had better leave old Zadok and go back for more. Just then, however, chance made the opening which my questions had been unable to make, and the wheezing ancient's rambling took a turn that caused me to lean forward and listen alertly. My back was toward the fishy-smelling sea, but he was facing it, and something or other had caused his wandering gaze to light on the low, distant line of Devil Reef, then showing plainly and almost fascinatingly above the waves. The sight seemed to displease him, for he began a series of weak curses which ended in a confidential whisper and a knowing leer. He bent toward me, took hold of my coat lapel, and hissed out some hints that could not be mistaken. Okay, so we're next to the sea, and this has been mentioned throughout the story. The sea is always there, and this is one of those symbols, classic symbols in human stories. If you go back a year, if you go back 10,000 years, some things will always have a similar feel no matter where you are. And it could be good or bad. For example, fire. In pretty much any culture, fire can represent safety, like you're at home, you've got light, you've got warmth, you've got safety. But fire can also represent anger and destruction and, burning down a city or something like that. So even these simple classic symbols can mean two things. The sea is another one like that. The sea, if you look out on a blue wave, you might feel calm and deep, and it's like a dream, and it's very meditative. Or the sea can represent the unknown, and there are monsters down there, and there are invaders coming across from foreign lands, and there's a representation of like it's the subconscious, it's the stuff under the surface that might come out and turn us into monsters. The sea can represent both of those things, and in this story, well, maybe for the Innsmouth citizens it feels more calm, but for the outsiders it feels like, ooh, what's in there? What's under there? Are there tentacles from the deep? Are there invaders coming from foreign lands with strange artifacts? That's the kind of stuff that Zadok Allen is feeling when he looks out at this, except maybe he knows a little more than we do. And by the way, I'm going to read a little bit of the next part, but it does have one annoying thing about it, which is that, when an author has a character with an accent and then they do all of these weird spellings to represent the accent, this has some of that. So if you got like weird looking words, that's the idea, is that this guy is an old sailor, and he has a very strange way of talking. But if you think about it for a second, it's actually not that bad. One thing I'm going to do is turn off the little suggestions. On Google Docs it gives you red underlines and blue underlines if it thinks that it's wrong. I'm going to turn those off because they just get in the way. So I'm going to go to Tools, Spelling and Grammar, and I'm going to turn off the check mark. And I'd recommend you guys do this too, just to make it look more normal. Okay, I turned off the red and I turned off the blue, and now it just looks like text instead of, Google trying to fix something that it's written that way for a reason. So that's where it all begun, that cursed place of all wickedness where the deep starts. Gate of hell, sheer drop down to the bottom, no sounding like can touch. Old Captain Obed done it, him that found it out. Morn was good for him in those South Sea Islands. Everybody was in a bad way them days. Trade falling off, mills losing business, even the new ones. And the best of our menfolk killed, privateering in the War of 1812, or lost with the Elizabeth brig and the Rangers, no. Both of them Gilman Venters. Obed Marshy had 3 ships afloat, brigantine Columby, brig Hetty, and bark Sumatra Queen. He was the only one who's kept on with the East Indian Pacific trade, though Esdras Martin's barkentine Malay Pride made a venture as late as 28. Okay, so this guy is talking about almost 100 years ago, right? It's after the War of 1812, because remember the story was written in the 30s, but it was about the 20s. And this guy is saying, okay, there was a time when a lot of guys were killed in the war, or sort of, traumatized by the war, and they were kind of floating around. When they say the South Sea Islands, they mean not south of where they are. These guys are on the east coast of the U.S. He's not talking about, Haiti and the Caribbean, which is south of that. He's talking about South Pacific, south of Japan. So they're talking about like, Polynesian islands, and some of the names they use are not the modern names that we use, but he's talking about the South Pacific. Most of those are like plentiful small islands with, short distance between. Some of them have long distance between. Never was nobody like Captain Obed, old limb of Satan. I can mind him telling about foreign parts and calling all the folks stupid for going to Christian meeting and bearing their burdens meek and lonely. Said they ought to get better gods like some of the folks in the Ingies. Gods is bringing good fishing in return for their sacrifices, and it really answer folks' prayers. Matt Elliott, his first mate, talked a lot too, only he was, again, folks doing any heathen things. Told about an island east of Otaheite where there was a lot of stone ruins older than anybody knew anything about. Kind of like them on Ponape and the Carolines, but with carvings of faces that looked like the big statues on Easter Island. There was a little volcanic island near there too, and what they were was ruins of different carvings. Ruins all wore away like they'd been under the sea once. Pictures of awful monsters all over. Well, sir, Matt, he said the natives around there had all the fish they could catch. Sported bracelets and armlets and head rigs made out queer kind of gold and covered with pictures of monsters, just like the ones carved over the ruins on that little island. Sort of fish-like frogs or frog-like fishes that were drawn in all kinds of positions like they was human beings. Nobody could get out of them where they got all that stuff. And all the other natives wondered how they managed to find fish, plenty even when the very next island had lean pickings. Matty got to wondering too, and so did Captain Obed. Obed, he notices, besides, that lots of the handsome young folks drop out of sight for good from year to year, and there wasn't many old folks around. Also, he thinks some of the folks look darn queer, even for Kanakis. It took Obed to get the truth out of them heathen. I don't know how he done it, but he begun by trading for the gold-like things they wore. Asked them where they come from and if they could get more. Finally wormed the story out of the old chief. Wallachia, they called him. Nobody but Obed ever believed the old yeller devil. But the captain could read folks like they was books. Hey, nobody ever believes me now, I tell him, and I don't suppose you will, young fella. They'll come to look at you. You have got some of them sharp reading eyes like Obed had. The old man's whisper grew fainter, and I found myself shuddering at the terrible and sincere portentousness of his intonation, even though I knew his tale could be nothing but drunken fantasy. Well, sir, Obed, he learnt that these things on this earth, as most folks had heard about, and wouldn't believe if they did hear. It seems these Kanakis were sacrificing heaps of their young men and maidens to some kind of god things that lived under the sea, and getting all kinds of favor in return. They met the things on this little islet with the queer ruins, and it seems them awful pictures of frogfish monsters are supposed to be pictures of those things. Maybe they was the kind of critters that got all the mermaid stories and such started. They had all kinds of cities on the sea bottom, and this island was heaved up from there. Seems there was some of the things alive in that stone buildings when the island come up sudden to the surface. That's how the Kanakis got when they was down there. Made sign talk as soon as they got over being scared, and pieced up a bargain before long. So I'm going to stop here. It is a little tiring for me to do that silly accent, but it is a good part of the story where you hear the background of how this happened. So Obed Marsh, the guy we heard about from the very beginning, kind of the godfather of the town, is here now, or at least recently, but he had gone to some islands in the Pacific, and he found one where there was something going on where they were worshiping these old sea creatures, these strange gods that were not the normal gods of the people around there. The other islands were totally fine, maybe having trouble catching fish, but this one island was getting some special deal from the monsters under the sea, and they could catch fish, and they could get gold, and they could do just fine, except they had to sacrifice some of the young people. And, well, maybe some of that got brought to Innsmouth here. Now, I'm going to let you guys read the rest. And this is sort of the, 60% mark of the story. Once we finish this, it'll be chapter 3 out of 5. And since it is all backstory, it's getting ready for the big stuff in the present day. Like chapter 4 and 5, there's going to be the danger. There's going to be a chase. He's going to see the monster. He's going to get out of town, and then the government's going to come in. This is not a spoiler because, of course, you knew that from the very first paragraph. But before we do that, I want to make sure you know all the stuff and know who's who. So today's assignment is pretty simple. It's just, hey, here are some characters. What do we know about them? Okay, 1, the narrator. I don't think we've seen his name yet. 2, the grocery boy. 3, Zadok Allen. 4, Obed Marsh. And 5, just the general Innsmouth citizens. Remember, we haven't seen Obed Marsh. We've heard about him. But you kind of get the feeling that if we did see him, he would be the most monstrous. He would be like that vampire I talked about. If you see the soldier vampires, the ones who go out to hunt, they might be pretty good looking, but then when you meet the Dracula in the castle, he would be really transformed and ugly. And well, you kind of get that feeling about Obed Marsh. The citizens of Innsmouth look a little weird, but if you met him, he'd probably be completely inhuman at this point. And who knows, maybe we will meet him in chapter 4 or 5. This assignment is to just make sure you know who's who, and then when we read chapter 4 and the action is happening, you'll know, who's who and what to be afraid of and where we're trying to get and all of that. And so for each one of these, just note down what we know. We might have seen them or we might have just heard. What they want, which is always the most important thing in his story. And if possible, what we've heard them say. So we've heard the grocery boy talk. We really haven't heard the Innsmouth citizens talk, except, our guys talked to the hotel manager, I think. Zadok has talked a lot. And what we know is that he was traveling in the old days. He has a strange accent, blah, 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 and so on. So I'm going to post this. I'm going to end the video. And next week we'll finish the story. We'll do a little quiz and start talking about our next one. Thanks.